We often think about human history in terms of, the big stuff. Migrations, empires, big
Right,
events.
the macroscopic view.
Exactly. But what if something microscopic like the wild yeast living on trees could actually tell us about those huge movements?
It sounds pretty wild, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive into this really fascinating new study. It's from the University of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Researchers Jacqueline Peña, Duda Ben Sasson. They've been looking into the DNA of wild baker's yeast.
And just to clarify, this is the same species we use for bread and beer, Saccharomyces cerevisiae.
Right, but the untamed version, the kind you find just out there on trees.
Exactly. Not the stuff that's been domesticated over centuries in breweries and bakeries.
And the really mind-blowing part is that these wild yeasts, they seem to hold a genetic record, a record of our ancestors moving across the planet. It's like a whole new lens on human migration.
It really shifts the perspective. Usually when you mention S. cerevisiae, you immediately think, okay, fermentation, humans making bread, making beer.
Yeah, human activities.
But this study, it focuses squarely on these wild populations, the ones living independently on tree bark or in the sap.
On leaves, too, and soil.
Yeah, even leaves and soil. There was already some earlier work hinting that, wild and domesticated yeasts were different, especially over in Europe.
Okay.
But this research wanted to get a much clearer picture, really characterize these wild groups in detail, both in America and Europe.
Right. So for ages, we've been using this yeast without maybe realizing its wild origins, its other life.
Mm.
But there's this whole other world of it out there on trees. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Go on.
The study actually found distinct genetic groups, subpopulations, they call them,
That's the term.
of this wild yeast in places like the eastern U.S. and also Japan.
Right.
And maybe the most intriguing part is these wild groups, they don't seem completely isolated from us. From human activity, there's a hint of a connection.
Exactly that. You see these separate, well, think of them like family trees, distinct lineages popping up.
Okay.
So in North America, for instance, they identified a few. There's North American A, found mostly up in Pennsylvania.
Interesting. Specific, yeah.
Then North American B, which is spread out a bit more. North American C, down in the southeastern U.S.
Okay.
And even a lineage they called American Wild, which is really broadly distributed, shows up down in Ecuador, Brazil even.
Wow, quite the range. And Japan.
Japan also had its own structure. They found a Japan A and a Japan B.
Okay. What about Europe?
In Europe, two main wild lineages emerged. One they called Wine European.
Suggestive name.
Right. Hints at maybe a closer link to, winemaking yeast, even if it's found wild. And the other is the European oak lineage, found, as you'd guess, mostly on oak trees.
And I gather that European oak group isn't just one uniform block of yeast.
Not at all. It actually breaks down further. They found clear substructure within it.
Oh, so?
It correlates pretty strongly with geography. So you've got a distinct cluster over in the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain.
Yeah.
Then other distinct groups in Italy, Montenegro, Greece, and Hungary, and even over the North Caucasus. It maps quite nicely.
Huh.
And another key thing they noticed, the genetic differences between these European tree strains, they're actually smaller compared to the divergence you see in East Asia or North America.
Smaller differences. What does that suggest?
Well, the thinking is it might mean a more recent colonization, that maybe this yeast only spread through European forests relatively recently compared to other places.
Okay, so we've got these different geographic clusters of wild yeast, like regional accents for yeast, almost.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
But how do we get from these tiny genetic variations to the big sweep of human history? Where's the connection?
This is where the timeline gets really exciting. The researchers were able to estimate when these different yeast lineages split off from each other.
How do they do that? Like a molecular clock?
It's exactly like a molecular clock. They looked at the mutation rate, how fast the yeast DNA changes over time. And they had to estimate, how many generations yeast go through in a year living wild on a tree. Their estimate was around 1,460 generations per year. Pretty fast reproduction.
Wow. Okay, so lots of chances for mutations to build up.
Precisely. So even small changes accumulate relatively quickly, ticking away like that clock.
So what did the clock say?
Well, get this. The estimated time when the non-Asian lineages split off from the Asian ones. It's around 20,000 years ago.
20,000 years. Okay, what was happening then?
That timing is really significant. It lines up beautifully with the end of the last ice age.
Right.
And crucially, with the period when humans are believed to have migrated into the Americas.
Whoa. Okay, so,
Yeah.
wait, as our ancestors were making these huge treks, like across the Bering Land Bridge, maybe, these tiny yeast cells might have been, what, tagging along, hitching a ride somehow?
That is the leading hypothesis, yes. It's pretty compelling.
That's incredible. What about the other splits?
They also estimated the diversification within North America happened around 12,000 years ago.
Okay.
And the split between the European oak and the wine European lineages, that looks like it was around 6,000 years ago.
And those dates also line up with
the spread of agriculture and, importantly, the early development of fermentation by humans, making wine, making bread.
So it raises this really fascinating possibility. Were humans, or maybe animals or insects, traveling with humans?
They're chemicals, yeah.
Were they unintentionally carrying these yeasts across continents?
It seems much more plausible than the alternative, which would be, yeast somehow naturally migrating globally on that scale.
Why less likely?
Well, yeast, first of all, on its own is pretty limited. And when you look at where related yeast species are found, it doesn't really support this idea of massive natural global yeast movements. The human connection seems stronger.
It's like we've been accidentally seeding the world with our microbial partners for thousands of years, just leaving footprints.
Microbial footprints, exactly, without having a clue we were doing it.
Okay, so that connects ancient history, but the story gets even more specific, right? It connects to a much more recent event. Something about French wine.
Yes, the great French wine blight. This adds another really amazing layer to the story.
What happened there?
So the researchers found something really surprising. Yeast collected in southern Europe, places like Portugal, Spain, Slovenia. Genetically, it looked a lot like yeast from the southern United States.
American yeast in Europe, how recently?
The genetic data suggests it arrived only in the last few centuries. And the timing points pretty strongly towards the 1850s.
The 1850s? That's the great French wine blight, isn't it?
Exactly.
Can you remind us what that was, and what's the North American connection?
Right. So in the mid-19th century, this tiny insect, an aphid called phylloxera.
Ah, yes, phylloxera. Nasty bug for vines.
Devastating. It came from North America, was accidentally introduced to Europe, and it attacks grape vine roots. It basically wiped out vineyards across Europe, especially France, a huge crisis for the wine industry.
And the solution involved? North America again.
It did. The only way they could save the European grape varieties like Cabernet, Sauvignon, Chardonnay, all those, was to graft them onto North American grapevine rootstocks, which were naturally resistant to phylloxera.
Ah, okay. I see where this is going.
So they started importing massive amounts of North American vines.
And the yeast just hitched a ride on the vines.
That's the most likely scenario. The yeast living on those American vines came along for the trip.
Is there genetic proof for that link?
There is. Some of these American-looking yeast strains found in Europe actually show signs of mixing genetically, admixture it's called, with the local wine European yeast lineage.
Yeah.
This suggests they haven't just arrived, but they've actually gotten into vineyards recently and started, mingling with the local wine yeast.
Fascinating. Did all the American types make it over?
Interestingly, no. They didn't find evidence of that North American A lineage, the one mostly from Pennsylvania, among these European migrants.
Still some mysteries there.
Always. And it gets even more tangled. They also found traces of both wine European and North American yeast DNA in yeast from orchards in China.
China? How?
Potentially linked to more recent human-assisted movement, maybe fruit trees or related materials, perhaps from Europe this time. It's complex.
Wow. It really highlights how interconnected things are and how easily these things can move around with us. Yeah. That transatlantic yeast migration, basically an accidental side effect of fixing the wine crisis.
Exactly. A direct, unintended consequence.
So stepping back, what are the bigger takeaways here? What does this tell us about, our place in the microbial world?
I think a key finding is that forests really do seem to be reservoirs for these genetically distinct wild S. cerevisiae populations. They're largely separate from the yeasts we use, or the ones closely tied to human stuff.
So domesticated yeast doesn't just easily escape and take over the wild?
It seems not. While yeast can obviously move from human environments into the wild, actually establishing and thriving there seems relatively rare. The wild populations maintain their distinct identities mostly. But, as that wine blight example shows so clearly, even if it's rare, human activity can have these major, long-lasting impacts on where species end up. Even microbes. Human-assisted migration is powerful.
And the researchers themselves pointed out this has implications for today, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Tuta Ben Sasson voiced this concern about the potential consequences of us moving microbes all around the globe now, often completely unintentionally through trade and travel.
If we were doing it thousands of years ago without knowing.
Imagine the scale today.
Yeah.
And we still don't fully understand the consequences. We still have basic questions about how these wild yeasts even live day to day on the trees.
Yeah.
What's their lifestyle actually like out there?
Yeah.
And it opens up broader questions too. How might our actions be driving evolution in other microbes? Things like fungicide resistance in fungi.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Or how fungi might adapt to climate change.
Yeah.
Are we inadvertently creating scenarios where pathogens could evolve or spread in new ways? It touches on a lot of things.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive into wild bakers, yeast genetics, it's opened up this hidden history book.
Written in DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Showing how these tiny organisms carry a record of ancient human migrations, but also these really surprising, more recent connections, like that transatlantic hop linked to the wine blight.
The real aha moment, I think, is realizing just how intertwined our story is with the story of these microbes we barely notice.
Totally.
Their genes reflect our history, huge events, small events in ways we're really just starting to decode.
Absolutely. And it definitely leaves you thinking, if this one species of yeast holds such an intricate record, what other incredible stories are locked away in the genomes of all the other microbes surrounding us?
Millions of them.
Millions. And maybe the more sobering thought,
Yeah.
what unintended consequences are our current global activities having on these invisible ecosystems right now? It really makes you appreciate the interconnectedness, doesn't it? And how our actions ripple out.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
A lot to think about.